when the banker's wife laughed at a 10-year-old child wearing a potato sack.
Really, Harriet, it looks as though she's wearing a potato sack left out in the rain.
She had no idea that laugh had just triggered the total annihilation of her family's fortune. Beside the girl sat Josiah Langdon, a billionaire cattle baron carrying $10,000 cash.
A town that laughs at a child is a town that needs to be reminded of its manners.
Then quietly made a move that would make the entire town speechless.
You can't do this! The railroad needs that land!
At 3:14 a.m. on a freezing November night in 1883, two men swung a sledgehammer toward a moss-covered granite marker in the Clearwater Creek. They weren't stealing cattle. They weren't robbing a stagecoach. They were shifting a county boundary by 40 feet. A 40-foot move designed to strip a dead hero's widow of her home, bankrupt an entire township, and siphon $600,000 out of the Pacific Northern Railroad line. A heavy iron hammer smashed into frozen stone in pitch darkness, instantly followed by the deafening rack of a Winchester rifle lever. The trigger wasn't pulled by a lawman. It was pulled by a woman whose 10-year-old daughter was currently sleeping in a gray wool garment stitched from a discarded potato sack. And standing 30 yards behind her in the dark was the richest cattle baron in North America. His name was Josiah Langdon. He controlled 40,000 head of cattle, owned 60,000 acres of valley floor, and carried $10,000 in uncirculated greenbacks stuffed into the lining of a dirt-encrusted canvas coat. He did not wear gold watch chains. He did not sign banknotes in front of witnesses. And until 9 a.m. that morning, no one in Clearwater, Nebraska realized that Langdon had spent 6 months secretly orchestrating the complete financial liquidation of every prominent merchant in the county. How did a cattle baron manipulate the entire town's economy without placing a single public bid? The town thought the widow, Cora Thornton, was broke. They thought her dead husband's $200 farm loan had spiraled into an unpayable $450 debt through sheer incompetence. They didn't know that Arthur Gable, the polished, pipe-smoking manager of the Clearwater First National Bank, had been quietly falsifying ledger entries for 14 months to trigger an artificial foreclosure. What explicit document did Gable destroy to hide his ledger fraud? Nor did they know that the brightly colored $4 a yard imported red flannel bolt sitting in the town mercantile wasn't just luxury fabric. It was the exact trap set to expose Gable's high society wife, Harriet, as the catalyst for an upcoming murder plot. Why was a bolt of red fabric the key trigger in a land seizure scheme? When Harriet Gable pointed at little Nellie Thornton's frayed elbow sleeves and laughed that the child was dressed in rain-soaked garbage, she thought she was merely enforcing the town's social hierarchy. She had no idea that her laugh had just cost her husband his bank, his house, his life savings, and his freedom. What horrifying secret did Langdon discover inside Gable's private desk drawer that morning? By noon, the entire bank would be emptied. By sundown, 6 armed men would stand in the lobby with no guns in their holsters. And by nightfall, the railroad would belong to a man who hadn't even bought a ticket. How did an insult over an old dress turn into the most ruthless corporate execution in frontier history? Who was the real shadow owner of the Northern Line? Before we continue with this story, tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is over there. Someone near you might be watching. Also, do not forget to hit the subscribe. Clearwater in the winter of 1883 was not a place for the weak. The wind came down from the northern ridges like a straight razor, stripping the bark off the elms and freezing the mud in the streets into jagged iron ruts. Cora Thornton stood at the counter of Higgins Mercantile, holding 5 small copper coins. Her fingers were raw, split red from washing hotel linens in icy river water. Next to her, 10-year-old Nellie stood perfectly still, her hands tucked tight behind her back. A single mismatched iron button held together her frayed, faded gray dress collar. Nellie wore a gray woolen dress handed down 3 years prior from a neighbor's growing daughter. The sleeves ended 2 inches above her wrists. The hem had been let down twice, leaving a dark, jagged stain of older gray cloth right at her ankles. Nellie's grandfather was Colonel Silas Thornton, the man who led the legendary midnight charge at Antietam, holding a crucial stone bridge against a Confederate battalion with only 90 men. A brass plaque bearing his name sat on a wooden post right outside the bank. But brass plaques don't buy oats, and glory doesn't keep frost off a bedroom floor. Why did Colonel Silas's war honor actually accelerate his family's destruction? The store door swung open. A heavy gust of sub-zero wind carried in the scent of pine wood smoke, expensive lavender perfume, and heavy imported silk. In walked Harriet Gable and Eunice Croft, the wives of the town's highest-ranking financial figures. Harriet's hat was pinned with dyed ostrich feathers. Her coat was trimmed with mink. The store fell into a dead hush as silk skirts rustled loudly against dry floorboards. Harriet stopped at the main display table where a fresh 40-yard bolt of scarlet-red flannel sat under the lantern light. It was imported, vibrant, $4 a yard, more than a farmhand earned in 3 days. Little Nellie's eyes drifted toward it. She raised her hand, her bare fingers hovering an inch above the soft wool. She didn't touch it. She knew better. Harriet Gable saw the movement. She looked at the red fabric. Then her eyes slid down to Nellie's mismatched iron button, to the frayed elbows, to the jagged hemline. "It's certainly no fabric for a farm girl," Harriet sneered, her voice echoing off the tin ceiling. "Looking at you, child, I suppose any fabric at all would be an improvement." Eunice Croft covered her mouth, letting out a sharp, piercing giggle. "Really, Harriet? It looks as though she's wearing a potato sack left out in the rain. You'd think the granddaughter of a hero would have a shred of dignity." Cora Thornton didn't scream. She didn't launch an insult. She gripped the edge of the wooden counter until her knuckles turned ivory, swallowed the fire in her throat, and took her daughter by the hand. They walked out into the biting cold without looking back. They didn't notice the tall man in the faded canvas coat standing quietly by the cast-iron stove in the shadows of the rear aisle. Josiah Langdon had seen everything. And Josiah Langdon was a man who remembered debts. What personal tragedy made Langdon target Harriet Gable with surgical cruelty? Josiah Langdon didn't look like a millionaire. His leather chaps were stained with trail grease, his boots were worn flat at the heel, and his wide-brimmed hat was caked in dried mud from the cattle pens of Chicago. Heavy leather boots thudded deliberately across wooden floorboards toward the mercantile counter. He walked straight to the counter. Higgins, the storekeeper, straightened up instantly. "How many yards on that red bolt?" Langdon's voice rumbled like distant thunder. 40 yards, Mr. Langdon," Higgins replied. "I'll take all of it." Harriet Gable gasped, stepping forward. "Mr. Langdon, I was just about to purchase 5 yards for my niece's winter coat." Langdon turned slowly. His eyes were cold, flat gray, devoid of a single drop of warmth. "You were," he said quietly, "but you were too busy laughing to open your purse." A thick stack of greenback bills slammed onto the glass display case. He peeled $400 bills from a massive roll, dropped them on the glass, and instructed Higgins to load the entire bolt into his farm wagon. Harriet stood frozen, her face flushed dark crimson. But Langdon wasn't done. Purchasing 40 yards of cloth was merely the opening pawn move in a game that was about to burn the bank to the ground. Langdon mounted his horse and rode 2 blocks down Main Street to the red brick Clearwater Bank. Inside, Arthur Gable sat behind a polished mahogany desk surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and gold-nibbed pens. "Ah, Mr. Langdon," Gable beamed, pulling out a sheaf of papers. "I have the grazing lease contracts ready for your seal." Langdon didn't sit down. He leaned his broad frame over the desk, placing his heavy hands flat on the mahogany. "I'm not here for my contract, Arthur. Pull the Thornton ledger." Gable's smile twitched. The room went silent, except for the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Gable attempted to claim bank confidentiality, unaware that Langdon held the mortgage on the bank building itself. "Bank policy prohibits," Gable started. "I own 60% of the capital sitting in your vault, Arthur," Langdon cut in, his voice dropping an octave. "Open the book." Gable's hands trembled as he pulled the heavy ledger from a bottom drawer. Langdon traced his thick, calloused finger down the column of figures. The original loan taken out by Cora's deceased husband was for $200, but the balance owed at the bottom of the page read $450. "What are these charges?" Langdon demanded. "Standard interest and late penalties," Gable stammered. "She missed a payment by $3. "And you added a $20 fee on a $3 shortage?" "The bank must protect its investors, Mr. Langdon. If a property cannot sustain itself, foreclosure is mandatory. Langdon slapped the leather ledger shut with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. It wasn't about $3. It wasn't even about $450. The Thornton farm sat directly on the narrowest choke point of the Clearwater River Valley, the exact geographical corridor required for the new Pacific Northern Railroad expansion. What secret map did Gable have hidden beneath his desktop blotter? Gable didn't want the cash. He wanted the title. If he foreclosed, he could acquire the land for pennies, sell the water rights to the railroad, and walk away with a $60,000 personal fortune. And his wife was mocking the widow's daughter while he quietly stole their home. Langdon reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out $450 in cash and dropped it onto the desk. Write the receipt. The debt is $0. Gable stared at the bills as if they were venomous snakes. His knuckles turned white around his fountain pen. Mr. Langdon, this is completely irregular. The foreclosure papers have already been drafted for county review. Write the receipt, Arthur, or by 2 p.m., I pull every dollar of the Broken Ridge accounts out of your vault, and I tell every cattleman from here to the Missouri border that Clearwater First National is insolvent. Gable's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained entirely from his face. With a shaking hand, he dipped his pen, signed the receipt, stamped it paid in full, and pushed it across the mahogany desk. Langdon folded the paper, slipped it into his breast pocket, and leaned down until his eyes were inches from Gable's spectacles. If I find one more fraudulent penalty on a working family's account in this town, I won't just close my accounts, Arthur. I'll buy the mortgage on this building and turn your office into a grain storage bin. Langdon turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the bank door swinging open as freezing air rushed over Gable's desk. Langdon stepped out into the winter sun, but as he loaded the 40-yard bolt of red flannel into his wagon, he realized something terrifying. Gable wasn't a man who accepted defeat. He was a cornered rat with a private syndicate standing behind him. Who were the 2 armed mercenaries Gable hired from the neighboring county at 1 p.m.? If the debt was paid, Gable could no longer seize the land legally through the bank, which meant he had only one option left: to secure the railroad water route before the county surveyor arrived at sunrise. He had to alter the physical boundary of the property by force. Langdon whipped his horses into a gallop, heading straight for the Thornton farm 2 miles outside town. The countdown to midnight had begun, and the widow had no idea that her property was about to become a war zone. 2 miles down the valley road, the Thornton farmhouse sat against a jagged line of black pines. The white paint was peeling, the front porch sagged, but the yard was swept immaculately clean, and firewood was stacked in perfectly straight, militaristic rows. Inside, the house was freezing. Cora Thornton sat at a small oak table, her sewing kit open, trying to mend the frayed hem of Nellie's gray dress with black thread because she had run out of gray. The loud rumble of heavy wooden wagon wheels crushed frozen mud outside. Cora's heart seized. A wagon usually meant a tax assessor or a bank deputy. She reached instinctively for the corner of the room where her late husband's old army blanket lay. She opened the front door. Standing on the porch was Josiah Langdon, holding his 9-year-old daughter, Eliza, by the hand. Tucked under his arm was the massive 40-yard bolt of scarlet red flannel. "Mrs. Thornton," Langdon said, taking off his hat, "I need a seamstress." Cora's posture stiffened immediately. Her chin went up. "If you've come to offer charity, Mr. Langdon, you can turn your wagon around. We pay our own way." "I don't give charity," Langdon replied flatly. "I make investments. I bought 40 yards of fabric to spite Harriet Gable, but my ranch hands need heavy winter shirts, and my daughter tells me red clashes with her boots." Eliza looked up and nodded solemnly. "It really does." Langdon set the heavy cloth down on the porch bench. "I want to hire you at standard commercial rates to stitch 30 work shirts, and as an advance on the contract, I want you to cut the first 4 yards and make a dress for your girl." Nellie stared at the glowing red fabric with wide blue eyes, the lantern light reflecting off the rich red wool. Cora looked at the fabric. She looked at her daughter's cold, thin hands. The breath hitched in her throat. Langdon wasn't giving her money. He was giving her back her dignity. Then Langdon pulled the folded bank receipt from his coat and handed it to her. "Your banknote is clear. Paid in full." Cora's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. "Mr. Langdon, this is $450. I can't accept." "Listen to me very carefully, Cora," Langdon interrupted, his voice dropping into a harsh, deadly whisper. Gable was adding fake fees to force a default. The Pacific Northern Railroad is building its main line through this valley. If they don't get water rights from your creek, they have to drill 3 miles of solid granite through the ridge. Cora went pale. "Our creek? Your creek is the key to the entire railroad line," Langdon said. "Gable lost his leverage at the bank today, which means tonight he's going to try something far worse. Lock your doors. Load your rifles. Do not trust anyone who comes down that road after dark." What weapon did Gable's hired men carry besides guns? By 2 a.m., the wind was howling down the chimney like a dying animal. Inside the farmhouse, the iron stove glowed faint orange. Cora sat at the table under a single oil lamp. Her shears cut through the scarlet flannel with a sharp, crisp bite. She worked with a quiet, furious intensity, measuring, pinning, stitching. She wasn't just making a dress for her daughter. She was stitching armor. A needle pierced the red flannel, pulling black velvet trim tight across the sleeve cuff. By 3 a.m., the dress was finished. High collar, full sleeves, lined with scrap black velvet at the cuffs. A dress fit for the granddaughter of a war hero. Cora hung it over the back of the chair, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out her husband's old Model 1873 Winchester lever-action rifle. The sharp, metallic double click of a rifle action was jacked in the silent room. Outside, the family dog let out a short, frantic bark, followed by dead silence. Cora moved to the frosted window. Down by the frozen creek, 200 yards away, 2 yellow lantern lights swung low against the snow. 2 men were standing near the old granite boundary marker the stone Colonel Silas had set 30 years ago. One man held a surveyor's wooden stake. The other held a 20-pound steel sledgehammer. They were going to smash the granite marker into rubble, drive the new stake 40 feet closer to the house, and claim the creek was legally on public county land before the official state inspector arrived at 8 a.m. Cora didn't call the sheriff. She threw open the porch door, stepped into the sub-zero wind, pulled the rifle butt tight against her shoulder, and aimed high. "Step away from the water," she screamed. The man with the sledgehammer looked up and laughed. "Go back inside, widow. The bank says this line was drawn wrong. We're fixing it." He raised the sledgehammer to strike the stone. A blinding muzzle flash split the dark, followed by a thunderous gunshot echoing off the ridge. The bullet smashed into a heavy pine branch 6 inches above the man's head, showering his hat with frozen snow and splintered wood. The sledgehammer dropped into the snow with a dull thud. The second man drew a heavy Colt revolver from his coat, raising it straight toward the porch. "You crazy bitch! I'll blow you off that porch." Cora levered another round into the chamber, her hands shaking, her eye locked down the iron sight. She knew she couldn't hit both men before they fired back. She was 2 seconds from dying on her own front porch. Suddenly, the earth began to vibrate. 4 heavy cavalry horses burst out of the dark pine shadows at full gallop, snow flying from their hooves. Out of the blackness rode Josiah Langdon and 3 of his toughest Broken Ridge foremen. They didn't carry lanterns, they carried lariats and repeating rifles. Langdon drove his massive black gelding straight between the gunman and the creek. Before the mercenary could pull his trigger, Langdon's foreman uncoiled a lariat and snapped it through the air. The leather loop dropped over the gunman's shoulders, jerking him backward out of his boots into a snowbank. Langdon reined in his horse, looking down at the man with the sledgehammer, who was now trembling in the snow. "Pick up your hammer," Langdon said quietly. "Mr. Langdon, we was just hired by Gable." "I said pick it up. Now start walking toward town. If you stop before you reach the bank, my 4 men will drag you behind his horse." The 2 men scrambled up the icy bank and ran into the darkness, but not before handing over Gable's written authorization paper and a full confession affidavit. At 8:30 a.m. the following morning, the sun rose bright and harsh over Main Street. Harriet Gable and Eunice Croft stood outside Higgins Mercantile in their fine fur cloaks, chatting about the town winter dance. Suddenly, the street went silent. Langdon's heavy farm wagon rolled slowly down the center of Main Street, flanked by 6 mounted ranch hands. Sitting on the bench beside Langdon was Cora Thornton, and sitting between them was 10-year-old Nellie. Nellie wasn't wearing the frayed gray wool. She was wearing a stunning, vibrant scarlet-red flannel dress. The deep black velvet cuffs gleamed in the morning sun. The high collar made her hold her head high. She sat like a princess riding through her kingdom. Harriet Gable dropped her leather purse straight into the muddy street slush in utter disbelief. Harriet recognized the fabric instantly. It was the exact imported wool she had claimed was no fabric for a farm girl. Nellie didn't look down. She didn't smirk. She met Harriet's gaze, gave a polite, measured nod, and looked straight ahead toward the bank. The red dress was the visual proof that Gable had lost control of the town, and the fraud was completely exposed. The wagon stopped in front of Clearwater First National. Langdon, Cora, and Nellie walked inside, followed by 6 broad-shouldered cowboys. Arthur Gable jumped up from his desk, his face ash gray. "What is this? You can't bring armed men into my vault." "They aren't armed, Arthur," Langdon said smoothly as the cowboys opened their coats to show empty holsters. "They're witnesses, and they brought a confession." The hired mercenaries had signed a full affidavit implicating Gable in land fraud at 5 a.m. Langdon threw the signed document onto the mahogany desk. Gable stared at it, his hands shaking violently. "This proves nothing," Gable squeaked. "The railroad needs that water. The county will seize the land under eminent domain. You can't fight the Pacific Northern Corporation, Langdon." Langdon looked at Gable with genuine, freezing pity. "Arthur, who do you think owns the Pacific Northern Railroad?" Gable froze. The breath left his lungs in a sickening gasp. "I bought 60% of the rail stock 4 months ago," Langdon said softly. "You tried to steal water from a widow to sell it back to a company I already own." Gable's secret map was useless because Langdon had already routed the terminal to Thornton Creek, revealing that Langdon was the true shadow owner of the Northern Line. Langdon pulled an official, gold-sealed document from his canvas coat and handed it to Cora Thornton. "This is a 10-year lease contract, Mrs. Thornton. The Pacific Northern Railroad will pay you $600 a year for the right to run a water pipe from your creek to the steam engine depot." This $600 a year contract restored Colonel Silas's legacy, replaced the destroyed records, and made Cora the wealthiest widow in the county. $600 a year was a fortune, enough to rebuild the farm, buy a prime herd, and send Nellie to any university in the country. Langdon turned back to Gable. "I am withdrawing every dollar of Broken Ridge capital from this bank today, unless you resign your post and leave Clearwater by sundown." By 5 p.m., Arthur and Harriet Gable had packed 2 trunks and boarded the outbound stagecoach under the silent, disdainful glare of the entire town. Their house was foreclosed. Their wealth was gone. Cora kept her farm. She sewed 30 winter shirts for Langdon's men and refused to take a single dime in extra pay. Because dignity isn't bought, it's built. 50 years later, an old black and white historical photograph captured an elderly woman in silk sitting on a grand porch next to a framed scrap of faded red flannel. When Nellie Thornton grew into an educated, influential woman of high society, she packed her belongings to move west. She carried fine jewelry, land deeds, and historical medals. But locked at the very bottom of her trunk was a small, faded square of red flannel with black velvet edging. She kept it to remember the winter day when a cattle king showed a small town that power isn't measured by the money in your bank, but by how ruthlessly you execute those who weaponize weakness. Langdon had stepped in to help Nellie because his own late daughter, Eliza, had faced similar cruelty years prior in another frontier town. While Arthur Gable was driven out of Nebraska in disgrace, financial historians recently uncovered a missing ledger in the bank archives of Chicago. A ledger showing that Arthur Gable was taking orders from a much larger shadow syndicate in New York, and their next target was Josiah Langdon himself. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.